In this module, we're going to be looking at managing user profiles, managing user data in an enterprise environment. And we're going to start in this section just by talking about what are user profiles, what do they contain, and what are some of the things that you can do in Windows 10. Roaming profiles, folder redirection, the primary computer setting, we'll be looking at all of those things. And then you do have another option. It was introduced back in Windows 8.1, and that is user state virtualization. That's a component of the desktop optimization pack. And it really is a new way to achieve the effects of roaming profiles, but it's done in a completely different fashion. So we'll go into that in some detail, and then we're going to revisit the migration of user profiles. We had briefly talked about it when we looked at installation, the user state migration tool, but we didn't cover it in very much detail. This is something that is frequently going to be required in enterprise environments. It's often associated with the enterprise deployments, which of course we just went through, but it's specific to user data. And so it kind of fits in here. But as I said in this first section, we just need to begin by clearly understanding user profiles. So in the Windows operating system, every single user has their own separate user account. We talked about that with authentication. It's necessary that that's the case because we need to be able to clearly and uniquely identify each individual. And I don't want people logging on with shared user accounts because that would give me limited capability of tracking activity. I wouldn't actually know who was doing something. I also don't want them logging on with the same user account because it would give them access to all the same data. And users do have personal data. It's going to vary from workplace to workplace how much personal data we are talking about. But every user is going to have some personal data. And then when we get into home and small business environments, that amount of personal data that shouldn't be shared with anybody else is going to only increase. And so every account that you have on the Windows system comes with a profile, a local profile. And this is stored in the users directory on the C drive. You'll have a folder in that directory for each individual user. The folder will just be named the name of the user. So if I have a local account named Patrick, then it's going to be C users and the Patrick directory. If I have a Microsoft account with my email address, then that'll be what's listed. If I have a domain account, then it'll say domain and then my username, okay? And so every single account, both domain and local, have a local profile, and in that profile, it provides or it contains settings for that particular user, and then those settings are persistent. So when I log in, I make changes, I add favorites, I change my spell check options in Word, I change a home page in Microsoft Edge, on and on and on we go. All of that information is saved in my user profile. And it's persistent, so when I log off, log back on, I don't have to change those things again. They are going to be there. So this includes registry settings, application configuration, and various directories, my documents, my pictures, the downloads, video, the desktop, and there are many more, favorites, contacts, everybody's favorite one, the saved games that we don't typically use in a business environment, but we've got all of those folders that are a part of the user profile. Now, technically, there are two categories of profiles. I find it humorous that we say there's two kinds of profiles and then there's four on the list. But the two kinds of profiles are what we're talking about. Two categories are local and roaming. Within roaming, you've got a couple of variations, but they're still roaming profiles. So a local profile is a profile that is only stored on that particular machine. It's not stored anywhere else. Local profile is the default profile type created the first time a user logs in, and it's created as a copy of the hidden default profile. So if you're a user, you belong to the domain, you sit down at a Windows 10 desktop, and you log in, it takes a copy of the default profile and uses it as the source for you. Then you go and make changes, those changes are saved, but it's local. If you were to get up and go to another computer that was a member of the domain and log in, you wouldn't expect to see those changes, nor would you be able to expect to see those documents, not by default. And so that's what a local profile means. It's not synchronized anywhere else. It's just on that machine. Hence the name roaming profile, which changes that. A roaming profile is a profile that is stored in a network location. This is a configuration of the user account and the properties of that account that you can access using Active Directory users and computers or the Active Directory Administrative Center. On the Profile tab, we can specify a path to a roaming profile. Now, what happens at that point is when the user logs in the next time, wherever they happen to log in, they make some changes. They've got their own local profile there. When they log out, that profile is going to be synchronized to the network location that's specified in their user account properties. The next time they log on from that system, there would be a synchronization just to check to see if there's any changes. If they then go log on to another computer that they've never logged on to before, then the entire profile would be copied down. As opposed to using the default profile on said computer, they're going to get a copy of their roaming profile. And so you probably follow me, or you may be already aware of this from previous versions. Roaming profiles mean your settings and your documents follow you around. You can log on to any computer and you would have the same favorites, the same application configuration, the same home page, the same desktop icons and documents. It would all follow you around. Now, there are a couple of variations of the roaming profile. Roaming profile is a read-write, profile. You don't have to or it doesn't restrict you from doing anything. But you can make a profile mandatory. And mandatory means that user changes that are made to the local copy are not preserved after logging out. So mandatory is still roaming, it's still in the network location, but an administrator has gone and done something to it, so essentially it becomes read-only. The correct way of looking at this, though, is I log in, I get a copy of the profile downloaded locally. I can make whatever changes I want locally, but then when I log off, none of those changes are preserved. And the way that this is done is there's a little configuration file that's created when the roaming profile is created. It's called ntuser.dat. You simply go find that file. It's a hidden file, and you rename it to .man. That's it. That makes it mandatory. And then those changes won't be preserved. The super mandatory profile was new in Windows 8 and still exists in Windows 10. And in this case, you're renaming the folder from just username to username.man. This will require the server to be available or else the login is denied. This is essentially going to make it so they can't make any changes to the system. They can't log in with a local copy of the profile without being able to communicate with the server. Now, the type of profile that we're going to choose is going to obviously depend on the scenario. If you've got a user who never moves from one computer to the next, there's probably not a need for a roaming profile. At that point, the only reason that you might use a roaming profile would be to get their documents to be stored on the server as opposed to on their local hard drive. But there are alternatives to doing that. Historically, roaming profiles have had, potential issues, and so we like to try to avoid them if we can. One of the alternatives to roaming profiles has been known as folder redirection, and it's an option that you have in group policy. The problems with roaming profiles is that if you go log on to another computer that you've never logged on to before, then it has to copy your entire profile down to that system, and that can take a significant amount of time, especially because people, store a bunch of stuff in their documents directory, maybe a bunch of things on the desktop. These profiles can get to be gigabytes in size. And so if you're logging onto the same computer and you're just synchronizing any changes, that's no big deal. But if you're logging onto multiple computers, it takes time for that whole profile to download. It also takes up storage space on the client computers. That may not be quite as much of an issue as it used to be, but it depends on the scenario. So what folder redirection does is it takes the folders that are normally stored in the local profile location and it redirects the folders out to a network location. The folders are not actually copied down to the client, and so it eliminates some issues with roaming profiles while still providing the advantages of being able to access your stuff at whatever computer you log on. The other advantage is making sure that the data is actually stored on a file server where it can be backed up, because it wouldn't be backed up on the individual Windows 10 clients. To say it's not copied over the network is actually a little bit misleading because you're using offline files features. So if network connectivity is lost, they will be actually able to access those folders because it has cached them. The reason that it's stated like that and why that's different, because sometimes we look at that and we go, well, wait a minute, how is that any different than roaming profiles then? The reason it's different is you don't have to copy all of the information down to be able to log in. When I click on documents, it just sends me to the network location. Behind the scenes, you're synchronizing and caching the documents so that if and when the network connection was lost, you could still access them, but your login process is not dependent on that. So that's the way that that's different. Additional features are available. You can redirect to different places. So if you have a lot of people, I don't want to redirect everybody to the same folder on the server. And by that I mean the same root directory. So you can separate it by departments. You can redirect the documents directory to a home directory, which is advantageous. If an organization has set up home directories for individuals, then they've already got a mechanism to map a drive for each user. They've got a special directory on the server. That information is getting backed up. So rather than having two different places where a user could save things and then forget where they saved them, we can just redirect to the home directory. You can take advantage of folder permissions and quotas. We could use disk quotas in Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2. We've got some significant advantages in a role known as the File Server Resource Manager. And so not only can you do quotas, but you can, at the disk level, at the volume level, but you can do quotas on a folder level. So you can limit the size that each individual user's folder is. You can also create file screens. And file screens would prevent the users from saving certain types of files into that directory. And since the directory we're sending them to is on the server, then it's controlling all of that. And there are even more things that you can do with that FSRM role. And certainly you can provide centralized backup so that if something is in fact lost, then we're able to restore that information. There was a new setting that showed up in Windows 8 and Server 2012. It's here in Windows 10, of course. It's called the primary computer setting. And the primary computer setting gives us control over which computers receive a copy of roaming profiles and which computers can be accessing redirected folders. This does require the Active Directory schema for Windows Server 2012. I believe we've mentioned that at some point before. That simply means that you've got to have a 2012 domain controller. Okay? Nothing special else has to be done. And then you need to configure the MSDS primary computer user attribute, which is using the Active Directory Administrative Center. That'd be the graphical way of doing it. You can use the set AD user commandlet in PowerShell if you'd like. And then following the configuration of that attribute, which just defines the primary computer for that individual, you can then choose some group policy settings. In group policy, I can choose to redirect only to the primary computer or to download roaming folders to primary computers only. This does not prevent the user from logging into other computers. There are ways of doing that, but it makes it so that they only get a copy of their roaming profile. They only have access to the redirected folders, if they're sitting on their primary computer. So it's a little bit from a security perspective, but also a performance perspective, so you don't have to copy you're not copying the folders and stuff elsewhere. It takes you back because the first thought when you think of roaming profiles and redirected folders is, well, then I can access my stuff regardless of what computer I log into. But every situation's different, but I want you to think back, to the places that you've worked or maybe the businesses that you've encountered. And the question is, how often is it that people actually move around and work at any desk? I know it happens. There are scenarios where it happens. It's not that common. A lot of the time, people have a desk. They're always at their computer. So at that point, what's the point of roaming profiles or redirected folders? There is a point. It's to get the stuff on the server so it can be centrally backed up, so you can take advantage of permissions and quotas and control file types that are saved and all of those. So at that point, you redirect the folders, but then you stick that primary computer attribute and you just say, hey, if Bob happens to go down the hall and log on to somebody else's computer, we're not going to copy all this stuff to them, and we're not even going to give them access to those folders, possibly. So we have to go back and consider the various reasons why we might be implementing these technologies.